Hello everyone, this is Genius Yoshi, and today we're talking Lorcana. In particular, we'll be focusing on the inkwell mechanic and its implications, as well as figuring out what is the best way to build an ink curve for your deck. But before we get to that, let's start with the basics. Once per turn, you're allowed to put one of your card into your ink pool. And to do that, you need to make sure that the card has this little inkwell symbol around the hexagon, which indicates the ink cost of your card. And then for the rest of the game, you'll be able to use the cards in your inkwell to pay for the cost of cards that you'll put in play. The first thing that I want to bring up about this mechanic is the fact that putting a card in your ink pool is far from free, and you actually have a bit more control over it than in other card games, because you can either play that card or put it in your ink pool, although you will have to put a certain number of cards in your ink pool in order to get started. So let's go over a scenario where you try to play a card in your inkwell every single turn. You begin the game with 7 cards in hand, and then you put a card in your inkwell, and then ideally, if you curve out perfectly, you put in your 1-drop, which means you're down to 6 cards in hand. You draw a card, you put 1 in your inkwell, play a second card, draw a card, put in your inkwell, put 1 into play. And the card count in your hand keeps on diminishing 1 per turn until you reach 6 cards in your inkwell and 6 cards that you've played, and suddenly the next turn, you play the card in your inkwell, you play the card, and you have no cards left in your hand. And then comes turn 8, and you have to choose. Do you play the card in the inkwell and do nothing, or do you put the card on the battlefield? So as you can see, we can't reach super high levels of ink simply by trying to play the card on curve every single turn. On the flip side, because you get to build your deck, you actually get to know your ink curve. So you can say, alright, based on the table on the page before, I know that I can't easily reach 8 inks. So I'm going to stop my curve at 5. In which case, I'm going to have this many 1-drop, this many 2-drops, 3-drops, 4-drops, 5-drops, and I know that after 5, I never need to put a card in my inkwell ever again, because that's the highest cost of card that I can play. And you'll say, well, based on the table before, why don't we stop at 7? That way we can play 1 card per turn every turn. Well, a lot of times being able to play multiple cards is going to be quite useful. In particular, if you're drawing a bunch of cards over the course of the game, you don't know whether you'll be drawing a 1-drop or a 5-drop or a 3-drop. So having the ability to play a 2 and a 3, or a 1 and a 4, or just playing your 5-drop for the turn actually gives you a bit more flexibility and is going to allow you to empty out your hand, getting the maximum value out of the battlefield. So I've presented you with one potential curve, but there's a multitude of different ink curves that we can consider. In particular, if we want to increase our ink curve, one option would be to simply not play a card every turn. And the best way to not play a card without having too much of a cost is to skip the early turns, because lower ink costed cards are going to be less impactful. So you can consider missing your 1-drop and say, I'm never going to be playing a single 1-drop. I would rather start my curve at 2, invest my first card into my ink pool, and then I can easily reach the 6 drops. In the same way, I can say I'm also going to skip my 5-drops, and on turn 5, what I want to play is a 2-drop and a 3-drop, or simply another 4-drop, and I'm willing to pay that price in order to increase the density of 6-drops that I have in my deck. Also note that if most of the cards in your deck can be played in your ink pool, you can actually smooth out your curve quite substantially by inking the cards that don't fit in your curve. Furthermore, we're also getting the partial free mulligan, which allows you to smooth out your curve quite a bit. So you should be able to predict fairly accurately with a simple curve like this. On turn 2, a 2-drop, on turn 3, a 3, turn 4, 4, turn 5, 2 and a 3, Turn 6, we're starting to play some of the bigger rocks. And then if we've eaten some of these lower cards early on, keeping some of our 6 drops, we might be able to go 6 drop, 6 drop, 6 drop, and then play out a combination of some of the lower cards. So how many Inkwell cards do we want? I've presented 5. I've presented a curve with 6. Well, let's look at the power level of cards and the actual cost. We can have a card as powerful as Aurora as a 5-drop, stats 3/5, 2 lore with a fairly positive ability. On 6, we have a 5/4 with some ability, 7, 4/6, 2 lore, and then we have Mickey Mouse at 8 with 4 lore, a 5/5. But when we're considering these cards, we also need to keep in mind the cost. If I want to go up to 6, it's going to cost me a card. If I want to go up to 7, it's going to cost me 2 cards. If I want to go up to 8, it's going to cause me to lose 3 cards. And I will have to skip a turn. If you plan your curve right, this turn should be early on in order not to have too much of an impact. So you need to decide for yourself, based on the power level of these cards, where you want your curve to stop. And stop your investment there. In particular, if you know your curve stops at 7, investing an 8 card in your ink pool is going to be mostly useless unless you really want to play like a 6 drop and a 2 drop within the same turn. But it is probably more beneficial to just wait an extra turn unless you're in a pinch. Alright, so Genius Yoshi, are you telling me that I should never be paying more than 6 ink for a card? Not at all. There are ways of pushing your curve that will still allow you to play powerful cards without making too many compromises. And the 2 main ways I can think of is through ramp. So cards that will also generate an ink in your inkwell. For example, this Mickey Mouse allows you to put the top card of your deck into your inkwell face down and exerted, increasing your ink cost, yet still playing something on turn 3. I think this card is actually very powerful. The other option is to play card draw spells, because cards that you draw can become cards in your inkwell, which in this case can help you draw more cards. Then the loop continues. But essentially drawing cards, it allows you to put more cards in your ink pool to feed these more powerful ink curves. And now we get to a different topic. Not every card has the inkwell icon. Which brings up the question, how many cards with the inkwell icon should you be playing? Well, I don't know exactly, but I brought in some tables here that tell you the percentage of chances that you'll be able to put a card in your inkwell on that specific turn based on this amount of cards in your deck, in your 60 card deck, having the inkwell symbol. For example, if you're playing 20 cards in your deck with the inkwell symbol, on turn 1 you're expected 95% of being able to play a card in your inkwell. On turn 2, 82%, turn 3, 63%. It's important to note here that we're not just taking the opening hand into account. As you're drawing a card every turn, your odds get progressively better of having enough ink cards to put into your inkwell. Also, there's a link to the website where I took this data from. It's actually a Magic site, but the same concept applies when it comes to drawing inkwell cards as drawing lands in Magic. For example, if we go to 40 inkwell cards, which is not that far-fetched since most of the cards we've seen have the inkwell symbol on it, then you can easily reach the 7 or 8 turn, or the 7 or 8 card with an inkwell symbol that you can put into your inkwell. Then there's also this idea of you might want to play some of these cards, which is quite interesting. In particular, if you go 50-50 and 30 cards in your deck have the inkwell symbol, and you want to play 6 cards in your inkwell, well, you'll have a 62% odd of landing it on turn 6. Assuming that you put every single card with the inkwell symbol into your ink pool. So as you start going lower than 40 into the 30 or even lower, then these inkwell cards are almost forced to go into your inkwell pool until later in the game when they actually become active cards. Which brings up the idea, well, if I'm forced to play these Inkwell cards into my ink pool early game anyways, maybe I should be picking up higher costed cards to go in the Inkwell, or some very specific cards that I know I can just bury in my Inkwell anyways, like item removal or villain targeted spells that won't become dead draws early game because you'll just eat them up into your Inkwell. Also note that we have the partial mulligan that is completely free, and by sending non-Inkwell cards back into your deck, you're essentially pushing your draw. So if you send 2 cards back into your deck, then you're actually moving up the probabilities based on the number of cards that you have in your hand. Let's put this into application. Now that we know that most of our cards with the Inkwell symbol are going to end up into our ink pool, consider the card Just in Time, which is a 3-costed card that allows you to play a character would cost 5 or less for free. Alright, well, in most games, these types of combos are situational because if you have a card like this, then you want to have a high number of 5-drops, but you don't want to be stuck with a ton of 5-drops in your hand that you can't play. Well, in Lorcana, you can play them in your ink pool. So you can pile up a bunch of 5-drops, aiming to throw a lot of those in your ink pool, having your 2-drops and 3-drops to fill in your curve. You can also use the partial mulligan to be super aggressive. Throw in every card you have until you hit a Just in Time, which means you can go 14 card deeps just on the opening hand, digging for Just in Time. And then you still have your filler 2-drops and 3-drops, but ideally skip turn 1, play a 2-drop to fill in to apply some pressure and tempo. Turn 3, Just in Time for a 5-drop. Turn 4, well, play a 3-drop. Let's take a little break. Turn 5, 5-drop. Turn 6, 5-drop. Turn 7, 5-drop. And your draws become fairly good because you have almost a 50% chance of drawing a 5-drop, which is fairly powerful. So you can make all kinds of interesting deck building by planning your ink curve, by saying what is the maximum ink cost that I'm willing to reach. Are there any reason for me to invest more into my ink pool, like using abilities of cards and still playing characters during the same turn? When do I want a double spell? We also need to be careful about how many cards we're putting in that don't have this Inkwell symbol. As we reach 20 or so, then we're starting to make sacrifices and saying that most of the cards with Inkwell symbols are going to get eaten up early on or early game into our ink pool, and only once we've fulfilled our ink pool are we going to start playing them, in which case we should be aiming for higher costed Inkwell symboled cards. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this video and this interesting discussion on the Inkwell and all the implications, or at least some of the implications, of the ink curve in Lorcana, which I think is going to bring some very interesting strategies. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe for more awesome content and eventually gameplay videos, especially once the cards come out.